Well, hello and welcome to this week's episode of Franchise Blind Spot. Per usual, I am surrounded by experts across franchising, and we are here to discuss a singular topic whereby missteps are often made that have negative ripple effects throughout a system that potentially we didn't recognize when initially making the decision. Of course, we know everybody in franchising is almost everybody in franchising is working toward doing things the right way and has the very best of intentions, hoping to lift everyone else up when they make decisions for a brand. But often, unforeseen ripple effects can actually do the opposite of what we intended. And we're here to draw attention to those things so that you can avoid those blind spots and put your brand on the right track. My name is April Porter, and I am the founder of Secret Sauce, the franchisee intelligence agency, and Business Vault AI, where franchisees protect the IP of the whole brand. And I'm joined here with several other experts. I'm going to go around and allow them to introduce themselves, and then we'll get into the topics. Alexis, why don't you tell us who you are and what your expertise is?
Yeah, Alexis Norby with Catalyst Group, and our thing is how we make locations open faster for franchise brands. So brick and mortar, service-scapes, service retail environments, getting them open, which is such an exciting spot. So you can start getting revenue in the door.
Awesome. Jonathan.
I'm Jonathan Pace with Reader CPA Group. I'm a strategic advisor here where we have a niche in franchising, helping new candidates that are looking at entity structure and funding strategy, as well as existing franchisees to make sure that they're doing everything they can from an accounting standpoint.
Jeff Leach, former franchisee.
Former franchisee. That's right, with Minuteman Press. Um, so I'm head of sales of a company called Vendasta, based out of Canada. We help companies such as Neighborly and many other franchisees automate their full customer journey with AI. So we have many different AI employees that help you along that path.
And we also are joined by Richard McIntosh, who is a funding expert, lender, and broker to help franchisees find the very best financing so that they can not only start their units, but also expand to more. And he will pop on here once he's available. So we all just got back from the International Franchise Association Conference, which is known as the largest conference in all of franchising worldwide, but particularly here in the US. It's where franchisors, large multi-unit franchisees, and suppliers gather to learn about what's new this year, what are we going to be working on, see what new innovations are out there. And there's a lot of education, a lot of collaboration and networking, and then of course a lot of shopping done at the conference. And so one of the highlights of the conference every year is the thought leadership roundtables. And those thought leadership roundtables are usually hosted by people just like here on Franchise Blind Spot with an expertise in a particular area. And so this week's topic actually was inspired by a conversation that took place at one of those at the round table that I was at. Now, the round table that I was at, the topic was about how to manage franchisees when you have a wide spectrum of stages. So from first-time business owners to single unit owners, maybe with some prior business experience, to multi-unit owners, to mega multi-unit owners, and then ultimately to multi-unit, multi-brand owners. And throughout the conversation, the um, the the topic turned to the FAC, which, if you're unfamiliar with that acronym, it stands for Franchise Advisory Council. And the Franchise Advisory Council is typically a group of franchisees that the franchisor forms. They form the group, and then the group could be made up of franchisees that are appointed to the position by the franchisor or elected by their fellow franchisees. And they usually meet once a month. The franchisor controls the agenda and brings topics to the franchisee for discussion, collaboration, also ideas. And then the franchisees provide feedback to the franchisor with the intention that it involves the franchisees in the direction that the brand is going, and that the franchisor is implementing things only after receiving franchisee feedback. And the idea behind an FAC is that it empowers the entire system to be on the same page and to be really knowing that what they're doing and the things that they're putting in place are not only desired by the franchisees, but will be impactful and help meet the goals of the franchisees, the franchisor, and the brand as a whole. So that's the intention of a franchise advisory council. And and so when the conversation turned to the Franchise Advisory Council, I had some questions about how the franchisors at the table were running their FACs. Because if you don't know me, I'm a franchisee first advocate. I help strategize franchisee performance, how to increase it from wherever it is to the full potential of what that franchisee could be, hopefully multiple units, because that provides wealth for the franchisee as well as a very valuable franchisee for the franchisor. And so I'm always advocating for how do we put the franchisees in the very best position we can for them to see that kind of success. And that's really where this conversation starts today, is that discussion around how does the FAC do that and how does the makeup of the FAC influence that. I was part of the FAC when I was a multi-unit franchisee. Jeff, were you ever on the FAC in your brand?
No, we were small here in Jacksonville, so that's part of this discussion.
That is part of the discussion.
Yeah.
So, so the first question I asked the table was, how big is your FAC in relation to your brand? And typically it was between 1% and 10%. And what I have found is that at the point in time where a brand decides they need an FAC in place, typically they make it about 10% of the brand. So if they're choosing to put an FAC in place and they have 100 franchisees, typically they're not going to have more than 10 franchisees on their FAC. And then as that brand grows, often that number does not increase. So ultimately, like my brand, we started off with 9 franchisees on the FAC. And as the brand grew, we had 9, but we grew to 800 units. So we ended up being just over 1% of the brand as far as representation. So that was pretty consistent with what my experience was. So the next question that I asked the franchisors was, how do they put people on the FAC? Are they appointed or are they elected? And this is where things started to get interesting, because we had the full gamut. We had people or brands that are appointing all the franchisees. We have brands that are electing a portion of the franchisees and appointing a portion. And I'll be honest, there was not a brand that allowed all of the franchisees to be elected, to be put on. So that's where we should start our discussion. As to, everyone here works with franchisees, and you have enough experience in franchising to start to weigh in. From the franchisee, like what do you think the advantages are to doing a combination of appointment and election versus pure appointment versus pure election for an FAC, based on the interactions you've had with franchisees?
Well, I can go first. I think it's interesting when you have that mix of appointed and elected. One of the concerns that I see, or one of the missteps that I've seen happen when it's entirely appointed is that you end up with an echo chamber or a group of people that all those franchisees have the same perspective. And then the ultimate goal of the advisory council, being able to provide you feedback on behalf of how your franchise network as a whole thinks, feels, wants to act, needs in order to be successful, is diluted because you're only really getting one singular perspective. So I'm always a fan of making sure that any appointment or election system allows for the broadest possible variety of perspectives, to make sure that you don't end up with those like groups. And you want the people that are difficult or challenging or potentially going to drive conversation in your brand in a way that you want it to go on that panel. So, um, not a popularity contest, not something that you want to just pick all your best friends and all your favorite franchisees to talk to that are the most similar to you. You want a wide variety of perspectives that represent your network as a whole.
Jeff, do you remember how yours was conducted?
Yeah, so largely you had to make President's Club. So what you end up with, I hate to say it, but you end up with the old boys club. Everybody looks the same. Alexis is spot on. They all look the same. They all sound the same. And when you describe the purpose of the advisory council, that isn't the purpose, right? If we just want to mirror, one thought, then great, put your own people in there. But if you really want to improve your brand and learn, then you have to bring in a diverse group. And sometimes that's hard because sometimes those are voices of people that aren't succeeding and they are maybe following the system, but it's not working for them. And you don't want that feedback, but you have to do it. And that ultimately makes your brand better. So I always recommend different geographies, people from different regions, people that are succeeding, and people that are, maybe even newer that aren't succeeding yet. But they can provide extremely valuable feedback on, hey, the process worked 10 years ago, but it's not working today. Um, one of the franchisees that I owned, the whole strategy was to go door to door selling. Well, the world's changed. Yeah, door to door is still important, but there's a whole new world of AI, a whole new set of technologies that probably not in that playbook, but it needs to be. And so that feedback is critically important for the brand. And if you're limiting yourself to the old boys network or, everybody that kind of looks and feels like you do as a CEO, then why even bother having the council? It's
Yeah.
just way
I
too hard to do.
I agree with that 100%. And when that last sentence you said, why even have a council? I see this a lot on forums as a suggestion when franchisors who are starting to struggle with their franchisees a bit get on and like in a forum and ask for help or this is what's going on. What should I do? One of the first recommendations I see is you should have an FAC. You should have an FAC. You should have an FAC. And I personally did not find that to be a solution for any of those types of problems because what it is oh, the franchisor in that situation, the franchisor gives them something, some kind of action to take, right? To say, okay, we're having this problem, so we're going to take an action. We're going to form an FAC, and so it serves the purposes of the franchisor. But if it's not set up right, it does not serve the purposes of the franchisee, and it does not ultimately solve the problem or the problems that inspired it to begin with. And so I see the FAC a lot of times at franchising being used like a band-aid. And that is the wrong application of an FAC.
Totally agree.
In our system, we had a hybrid where we had two franchisees that were appointed by the franchisor, and then the remainder were elected. And one year they did it where it was just a general election, and anyone could be chosen. Anyone could be elected regardless of geography. And then there came a time where they broke it up geographically. and said, okay, there's going to be a representative from this region, from that region, and so on. Um, the other thing they did is they had requirements. You had to be in good standing, which meant you had to be paying your royalties, you had to be compliant with all brand standards or remodels or whatever was the current system expectations. But that disqualified a lot of the people who were struggling, who didn't have the extra cash to do the latest remodel. And that was one of the, sticking points for them. And one of the things that they truly wanted to have a discussion about was why are you trying to force me to do a remodel and spend 10 to 25,000 on a remodel when you can look at my revenues and see that I'm not making the money I should be making, that I'm in the bottom third. So that was one of the questions that I posed at the table. Was I asked the franchisors in attendance, how many of you have people in on the FAC that are in the bottom third of your system? And I got a lot of pushback from one of the franchisors who immediately said, "Why would I want people in the bottom 20%?" Actually, what he said is everyone knows that in franchising, you have a top 20%, a middle 60%, and a bottom 20%. Why would I want people in the bottom 20% who aren't doing what they should be doing? They're not meeting the metrics, and they're just in the system until they're eventually going to fail and either sell or close. Why do I want their feedback on the FAC? So that was one of the comments that sparked this discussion. And I have a lot of thoughts, but I would love to hear, like, if you were sitting at the table and had heard that response, having been a franchisee and having everyone here worked with franchisees regularly, what advice would you have?
By the way, well, somebody else jumps in, but good for him for saying that because the reality is most people believe that and
Correct.
wouldn't say it. So at least it's out there, but I'll let others chime in and then I have strong feelings there.
Well, you could just continue with your strong feelings, Jeff.
So first of all, if they're bottom 20% and you really believe that they're going to fail and churn out, why are they still there? Like if you feel like they've gone rogue, they're not doing anything in the system, I mean, you're just killing your brand. You're letting those people fester. And by the way, they tell others, right? So that becomes an issue for your brand. Um, so if that's really how you feel, then get rid of them. They're not good. But if it's just that they're the bottom 20% from a revenue standpoint, look, a lot of these people, mortgage their 401k to start this business. They don't want to fail. They want to be successful. And those are the people you want the feedback from. You want to know what's going on, what's not in our playbook that should be. What are our successful ones doing that we didn't let you know about? Bring that to bear. That's the value. I mean, it's the old saying, you never waste a good mistake. Like, man, you have gold there. Use it. Make yourself better. I mean, that's how you build your brand. And so, absolutely, you want those people. You're going to learn a lot more from them than you are from the ones that have been doing the same thing year over year. So, yeah, I just, I hear it, and I'm glad the guy said it, because it is the popular opinion is no, no, let's just let the people from that made the President's Club be on the advisory council. But what do you really learn at that point?
Right. Right. Alexis, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I agree, and I think it depends on your perspective and what you're trying to achieve with the advisory council. I've seen franchise groups that when they're talking about implementing new things or growth or progress for the brand, they have qualifications on you need to be in the top, X% or be open for this long before we're going to bring your idea to beta, or you have to be performing at X metric before you're part of the beta tests. Um, And that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't that valuable insight from that bottom third or bottom 20% that you need to be figuring out what in your existing system is broken that's not allowing them to perform to their maximum. And it could very well be a bad franchisee franchisor fit where they're just not someone that you want to see in your network, at which point get them out, get their location flipped because they are doing damage to your brand. And if it's just a metrics based, they're performing at the bottom, there's always going to be a bottom, regardless of what that is. That's the math. Um, how can you raise up the entire network as a whole by figuring out what is going on in that section for sure? So I think it's a combination. I think it's wise to look to problems and how do you patch it when you're talking about that. And it's wise to have some restrictions on where you're looking at for, okay, how are we going to beta test and pull in new ideas?
Jonathan, any thoughts?
I mean, the financials of like a median franchisee, they look way different than the top quartile. And so if all we're looking at is the top quartile, it's not really setting realistic benchmarks for, those at different stages of their franchise. And to get valuable feedback, you really need to get it, from multiple angles.
Yeah, that's true. Even like some of those bottom people are bottom because they just opened. Like, and if you're not, so if you're only getting feedback even from veterans, you're missing how the onboarding process and the ramp up process to profitability is affecting franchisees as they come in. Because if you haven't changed that in 3 years, the effectiveness of your ramp up period is probably declining and needs to be addressed. So that's another aspect of being in the bottom is that if we're talking about bottom by revenue, that's going to include all of your newest franchisees. Richard, do you have any thoughts to add in here?
So I'm on the lending side. So God forbid that one of my clients that I lend money to is in that bottom third. It's exactly what Jeff said. Some of these people are actually using their 401k to purchase this, or they're using friends and family or their own life savings. But when I'm lending money to them, they're pledging their house and everything. And we would really, as a lender, be disappointed to hear that the franchisors really kind of figure, well, we're going to cast off that 20%. We're going to write those guys off because that is not something lending ever would want to know. And having said that, and we deal with the franchisees personally. I mean, we get to know them very well. That would be very discouraging to hear that, and I totally agree. Maybe it's not a good fit. I understand that, and maybe that they're just not following the program at all, and I get that. So then maybe you have to cut them loose. But if somebody's new or they're struggling, I think it'd be very valuable for them and also the brand itself to bring in those people and have them voice what their concerns are, what their problems are, and for the brand to come in and try to, as we were saying, there's always going to be a bottom, but where's that bottom? Is it subsiding or subsistent, and they're able to succeed eventually? Um, you're never going to get there if you don't allow those people to come in and voice their concerns. So I don't know what the mix should be. I definitely think that some people should be elected or something other than being just appointed. That's for sure. Because you will. That's exactly what I was going to say, Alexis, when you said it's going to be an echo chamber. That's all it's going to be.
Mhm.
And just like I think it was maybe Jeff or you were saying that, what worked 3 years ago on the startup side is not going to be working now. And how would you ever get that feedback if you don't let these newer people or people who are the bottom third voice their opinion and seek help?
So, a few things that I took away having been on a franchise advisory council with the appointed ones were definitely part of an echo chamber. They were the top performers. They were huge fans of the franchisor and the brand because they were making the most money by far. I mean, they were beating other we like in my brand. to make $15,000 a month was considered to be an A gym. The top 10, well, is that right? No. The top the top 10% when we were at about 800 units was probably making somewhere between 20 and $24,000 a month. The top like top percent, the top 10 people were making 30,000 or above, and the top was making $50,000 a month. So there was a $20,000 and that's a huge percentage. It was almost a 50% higher revenue per month than the rest of the system. And that was one of the appointed franchisees. So anytime there was a question about whether or not the franchisor was providing enough or making the right decisions, when they every single time were like, oh, 100%, everything they do is fantastic, because they didn't have any struggle or worries or concern. It was working for them. So that not only was it like an echo chamber like of a franchisor, or maybe it's just the yes men of the franchisor, was completely disconnected from reality from 99% of the rest of the brand. And when you only have 9 people out of 800, that's a seat to take, that is not really providing accurate experience from what's happening in the brand. Also, in our franchise, when I went to the very first FAC meeting, I had been elected along with 2 other individuals because we were part of an independent association. There was a large portion of our brand that had formed an independent association because they didn't feel like there was a voice to talk to the franchisor. Once the independent association formed, the franchisor made an FAC in response, saying, okay, well, we're going to create a council to hear from, not the independent association. So all of the people in the independent association, they voted us on. So we went in with a list of real concerns that we had talked to these 160 units about what needs to be talked about with the franchisor. And when I went to the first meeting and we were doing social hour with the other 6 people, I met the top franchisee who had no concerns because they were making so much money. But then I met that the other reasons that people ran to be on the FAC were superficial. One person said, well, I want to be on the FAC because FAC gets the first release of brand new t-shirts and apparel. And they get to weigh in on what those are going to be. And I want to be in the know. And I'm like, I'm representing 160 franchisees, like half of which aren't making any money, right? That's why we're here. So it's so important to have a wide breadth of experiences on the FAC and to not run the FAC as a spirit club. And I see that happening a lot too, where, okay, guys, like our first meeting, okay, so we're rolling out next season hand wraps, because we had hand wraps because we were a kickboxing gym. Hand wraps, which colors do you guys vote on? And I'm like, that is not a good use of my time or expertise to vote on hand wrap colors, right? I'm here to make positive change for the people who are struggling and also positive change for the people who are making money. Like we all want to grow together, but we have to identify what's going on. And if we just ignore that bottom portion that is struggling, whether it's 20% or a third or a half, but if we ignore them and we write them off as like, well, the reason you're struggling is because you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, that's an assumption that we're making if we haven't actually included them in the conversation for discovery to find out why are they and guess what? When people aren't making money and people are struggling for a long period of time, they become bitter. They become angry. They become difficult to work with because they're so frustrated and they're so fearful that if this doesn't work out for them, they will lose their 401ks and their homes and ultimately potentially their families, because non-entrepreneurial spouses don't like to hang around when the entrepreneur in the family lost everything and more and took away their whole future. So that there is a statistic that says entrepreneurs have a 30% higher likelihood of divorce, depression, and suicide. And I don't think we talk about that aspect of business ownership really and franchising at all. And if we think about that and we think, okay, if we were looking at our system, where are the franchisees in our system that are shouldering that 30% higher risk? And and are we acting in a manner that's adding to that or that's trying to alleviate that? I think if we ask those questions more often, then we'd actually be a more ethical community. And as you know, I'm a proponent of ethical franchising over responsible franchising. I think it's a higher standard that we need to be asking ourselves if we're really being ethical. Um, the gentleman who said to me when he said in particular, well, you know, they're just basically hanging out in the franchise until they close or sell. My response is, if you truly believe that, then why are you not having a conversation to release them from that obligation? Because again, I don't believe it's ethical to know, well, in 6 months down the road, they're going to shut their doors and that'll be the end of that. But in the meantime, we're going to continue to take royalties from them. We're going to continue to take technology fees. We're going to continue to make make their livelihood difficult instead of coming together and saying, look, this isn't going to work. This is where the runway's headed. How do we mitigate the damage at this point in time? And I know why franchisors don't want to do it. I know it looks bad on an FDD to have a closed business, but does it matter if it's going to close today versus 6 months from now? That's not going to change the FDD. So, so those are some things that came to mind, and those are the questions I think are deeper questions that we should be asking in franchising to start to have a way to balance our decisions. It's easy to say, well, that's how everybody else does it. Nobody else puts the bottom third on their FAC, and that's the advice I'm getting. But is that the right move? Well, you need to have a way to measure that decision ethically. And I think these are the tougher questions that we need to discuss that offer that measurement tool.
Love that.
Yeah. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on that.
And look, ultimately, by letting them hang on, you're doing a huge disservice to your brand, your
Yeah.
brand in the industry, which is why everybody else bought in, is because of your brand reputation, because of that playbook. And yeah, I mean, it's not just ethical, it's the right thing to do for your brand.
Hmm.
And people should understand that.
Yes. And I think another good question is if I'm unwilling to do that, why? Because I think a lot of the reasons that stop franchisors from doing those types of things is their own fear of failure,
Yeah.
right? Like, well, oh my gosh, what are those reasons that are holding you back? Because if money was no object, if it was not going to hurt your reputation, would you hold someone's feet to the fire like that, or would you simply say, hey, let me help you out here, and we can't turn back the clock. We can't put money in your pockets that doesn't exist, but we can mitigate the damage, right?
Well, and I think it's important too when you think about rollouts, initiatives, changes, anything on the brand, we always advocate doing that in a broad spectrum as well to collect data. You know, I wouldn't just remodel your top performers and make them higher and assume like, oh, that data is going to roll out consistently throughout the network. But what does it look like to take somebody that is selling top in a category and add that new sign? And what does it look like to take some of the bottom performers in that same category and add that new sign? Does that sales training, that signage, that fixture make the same impact? Is it a different impact? How does that ROI for those individual owners? Because when you actually have that data, rolling out those things across your network becomes so much more clear. Because if you say, I'm going to launch this new initiative and it's going to improve XYZ performance, and you only tested it among businesses that looked the same and that didn't actually represent the breadth of your network, to Jonathan's point, that median doesn't really count, right? We need to have a variety of data. If you're in the top or you're in the bottom, this is what type of percentage gain we think that this investment will gain. And I think that's really important when we've seen those initiatives roll out, whether that's through the advisory council or through any of your other initiatives.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Alexis. And that is what an advisory council should be used to do is test initiatives and figure out the data behind it as you're ready to, and be able to tweak it, right? Optimize it and fix it and as you roll it out to the whole system.
100%. You want the stress test on all ends of the system anytime you're looking at improving, tweaks, new ideas, new categories. You want to kind of know from the person that is like Jeff said earlier, just join the network. Maybe doesn't have a lot of business experience to the person that's been doing this for 25 years. How do you make sure that what you're rolling out is going to appropriately help all of those people? And where are the gaps that you need to be able to fill in?
Yeah.
And you said something, Alexis, you used the word median, and I think that's really important. Look at the median, not the mean, but the median.
Yep.
Because there's always outliers, and outliers skew the mean. So, yeah, I was just thinking about that, where if
Yeah.
the predominance of franchisees happen to be lower revenue, that's your median.
Hmm. Yeah. Very good. Well, I think today was a really fabulous conversation. And I hope that everyone viewing it has taken something away from it, even if it's just something to contemplate and something, maybe some scenarios to run through and say, okay, if this did show up in our brand, what would we do? How would we look at it? It's a lot easier to look at this stuff as a hypothetical when you can be objective than once it's actually happening in your brand, emotions are involved, the money matters, right? And it gets a lot harder to make these decisions. So if you can look at these things now and you have your own evaluation process or your own, this is how we're going to run an FAC and make it equitable across the board, then you aren't tempted later when those emotions and those other pressures and temptations come in. You're not tempted to deviate from that process you created objectively. And that's one of our hopes here with the blind spot, is that we're drawing your attention to things that you may not have thought of otherwise before your brand has to face them in the real world. So we hope that you will join us in a couple weeks for our next topic.